So I really wanted to talk about social distancing and how it might affect social etiquette. I've realised for a long time that there are these unwritten rules and unspoken rules that govern the behaviour that different people use when they're interacting with each other, especially when it comes to how strangers interact, where we're not sure what the right level of intimacy or formality perhaps is. And of course, this social distancing has and is still changing what our unwritten and unspoken rules are. Kate Fox a few years ago wrote a really interesting book, actually, where she studied sociologically the different unwritten and unspoken grammar rules that generally govern our social interactions. What are the atypical types of behaviour that we would tend to follow in order to sort of fit in? Well, from my own experience, a few years ago, I did a cycling trip across the UK, and I was going through the north of England and also up to Scotland. And that involved going through lots of small villages and also lots of towns and large cities as well. And I was following along different cycle routes, and I would be going at a slow enough pace where I would often go past pedestrians and other cyclists. And I would often nod or smile or exchange a greeting, hello, how are you? Nice weather, that sort of pleasantry. But I realised that the rules are slightly different in a village that you're going through as opposed to a larger city area, where if somebody makes contact with you in a village, you absolutely have to acknowledge them and reciprocate and return their greeting. In fact, you have to do that also in a city, to be honest. If anyone makes that attempt to sort of make contact, they might want to ask you a question or have some sort of reason for that. In the village, though, there is no specific reason. It's just courtesy. If you happen to be passing someone, it would be considered quite rude and also offensive if you were to pass by someone and didn't acknowledge them at all. Whereas in the larger city, it's quite normal just to sort of cycle past people or walk past them, within your own world, just focusing on your own things. Somebody could be in a hurry, they could be busy, they could be thinking about things, or even if they're not, generally as a rule, you don't acknowledge someone, you don't give any greeting or pleasantry, not in a large city, not in the way that you would do in a village, where you pass by anyone in the village, the large majority at least, it's customary to exchange greetings, pleasantries, even if it's merely a brief smile, a nod of the head, and eye contact. Whereas there is no requirement to do that to any strangers at all when you're passing by in the city. Now, where it's much harder to negotiate is where you get the middle areas, a larger village or smaller city, a sort of township area, somewhere in the middle. And there you have to sort of negotiate and look more for the signals of the individual. Are they looking to gesture and make eye contact, or are they sort of busy on their own route and sort of concentrating on their own things? So, you have to sort of be more aware and attentive to the individual, because the rules governing a town are less explicit. It's harder to know what those are. Whereas in a village, it's much more easier. You generally say hello and exchange greetings to all people that you meet. There may be rare exceptions to that rule, whereas the opposite is true in the city. You generally ignore all that you pass, but there are occasional exceptions to that rule also. Someone looking for directions somewhere, for example, or someone who's drunk too much, or someone who has some other legitimate reason that they might want to engage you in some conversation. So it's very interesting. What are the type of grammatical unspoken rules that we tend to assimilate towards in our different meetings and associations with different people according to what the context is. A different situation will imply a different set of rules. You know, we have a different type of formality in how we greet people, in the type of gestures that we'll use, and the type of language that we'll use also. If you think about the context, the environment of a business meeting or an interview, you're much more likely to be much more formal, and you might handshake. You wouldn't go over to them, certainly, and have a hug and be more friendly and slap them on the back and sort of use colloquial language. So the type of gestures, bodily movements, and the type of language that we use is very much governed by the type of situation and the different kind of regulations that are employed within different situations. So we've got to consider what the environment is, what the specific situation, and what the people are too. But it's not always obvious what those are, because rules can also change according to the circumstances. You know, like I mentioned earlier, you know, you generally don't go up and speak to a stranger or even acknowledge them when you're passing by them in a very large city, because you'll be passing by perhaps hundreds of people if you're on a busy commute going through a really densely populated urban area. You couldn't stop and say hello to hundreds of people, could you? But there are times when you might break that rule if there's a good reason to. You know, if you were injured and you needed help, if you were lost and you needed directions, or if somebody perhaps has drunk too much, you know, and you're just on a night out and having a laugh, you know, you might want to do that then. Or there might be other, you know, a variety of other reasons why it might be legitimate sometimes to break the rule. Even when you've had a drink, and you know you're having a chat with other strangers that have also drunk a bit, you still have to negotiate and read the signals. You know, do they want to actually have a conversation? Because there is also there, of course, the risk of offending someone and forcing a conversation on someone that hasn't invited it, of course. And it's harder to tell when you've drunk a bit, to read people's body language, actually. Because when we've drunk, we tend to be overly confident, and we tend to forget what those rules are. And so, you know, the rules and our understanding of them do vary according to a large number of different reasons. Well, I had an interesting example earlier on where there was some ambiguity and I wasn't sure what the actual correct response was. So I'm walking up my street. There's some neighbours sitting on a wall and in their garden who are busy chatting away to each other quite happily. And I'm walking past them nearby, and I, as a neighbour, felt it's right to at least acknowledge them, and to nod and perhaps say hello, or but then at the same time they're deep in conversation too. And I know that it's one social etiquette rule: you don't interrupt someone when they're in the middle of speaking in a conversation. So if I approach two friends, or even associates, they're in the midst of a long conversation, I don't barge in and suddenly interrupt them. I wait for them to acknowledge me and to stop at a convenient moment for them. Otherwise it will be considered quite rude, you know, especially if I don't know the people so well. If I know them and I know they're okay with that, that's perhaps different. If they're associates or colleagues perhaps, or even strangers, you know, that I'm meeting, then I don't interrupt them. I wait for them to finish their sentence and for them to then acknowledge me. You know, that's another social etiquette rule. But that's if you're going to meet someone. But what if you're just walking past them as a neighbour? And a neighbourly thing to do is just to nod, give a brief wave or slight smile. How the weather's nice, you know, that sort of pleasantry you might exchange. You acknowledge them briefly in passing, unless you know them well, to sort of instigate a conversation. But then if they're deep in conversation already and they haven't noticed you, I wasn't then sure if they had noticed me or not. That was where the dilemma lay, really. So I wasn't sure if I don't say anything and walk past, that could be considered rude. I've blanked them. But then if I'd stop and maybe say a brief pleasantry, then maybe I'm interrupting the conversation they're in the midst of. So there was a situation. I sort of said hello but kept walking, and they sort of nodded and then carried on their conversation. So I wasn't quite sure if that was right or not, to be honest. But there's ambiguity in some situations where you get one particular rule that's competing with a different rule, and you're not sure which one to abide by, and you try to sort of live with both of them, but it's quite hard. It involves some negotiation where you keep one of them more than the other. And so sometimes it does involve sort of like discerning and making split-second decisions, what to do. And I find that quite testing, but I suppose it's trying to sort of navigate those unspoken and unwritten grammatical rules of etiquette. And in the current situation, with so many believing, that social distancing is necessary for us to limit the spread of the perceived infectious disease at the moment, then it's all the more ambiguous in certain situations. People are much more respectful in keeping a distance. I've noticed that when we pass by someone on a narrow pavement, that people will tend to do an arc walk where they'll walk rather than straight through. They'll walk sort of around someone. Now that's okay in an ordinary street where you've got enough room and there's no traffic passing by you. But then that creates a difficult dilemma if you're on the edge of a very busy road. You don't want to arc around someone and push them onto a car. It's sort of like, so therein is a situation. I've kind of seen people standing by, lurking behind a tree or behind a parked car while they'll wait for the pedestrian to pass by them. So that seems to be the emerging etiquette, that you'll wait and in an adequate space, and sort of some people back themselves into a wall and breathe their stomachs in a little bit, actually. And so they get into the nearest space and allow the person to pass by them. Or the other way I've seen people doing is to walk quickly by each other, and rather than pushing one of each other onto a busy road. So it's negotiating situations like that, and what is the etiquette, that's respecting both the other person and also ourselves as well. And it's trying to sort of negotiate in ever-changing organic environment, ever-changing understandings of what those social rules are, what is the best practice. Actually, there was a rather funny incident the other day also that was a bit odd. I was walking in a certain direction up this path. I was walking towards home, actually, and I was sort of walking through various pavements, and there was another gentleman walking the same direction, but he was just about a metre or so behind me. And this happened for some minutes, and it looked kind of like he was following me, because we were walking at nearly exactly the same speed. And it did feel a bit odd, the fact that we were walking so closely to each other. At one point we were sort of like a metre or two apart and walking along, along the same pavements. I then crossed over the road because I thought this is a bit awkward, to be honest with you. And, we're walking together but not, and we haven't acknowledged each other. And it felt a bit odd somehow to me. So I felt like I'm going to cross over the road and walk alongside, opposite him, up the pavement. And so I felt that was the right thing to do in that situation. I could have stopped to say hello or acknowledge him, but then, I don't know him as a stranger, and what would be the purpose? I also thought maybe I should have slowed down my pace to allow him to sort of get some distance ahead of me, so that it wouldn't seem like we were walking together when we weren't. We didn't know each other. We just happened to be going the same direction. And it was quite funny. Every time I sort of turned up a new street, he happened to be going there too. I knew he wasn't stalking me or anything. It's just that it was only for a few streets. But it's just odd situations like that, isn't it? That you're not quite sure what to do sometimes. But sometimes, you're bound to sort of make a mistake and do something that's a bit awkward and a bit embarrassing. And sometimes, that's quite funny and a good source of humour, actually. But in the case of somebody being forced to sort of walk on a busy road, there are serious implications then, where you have to also consider the welfare and the safety of other people and yourself as well too. So sometimes, breaking social etiquette rules doesn't have any real kind of problem. It's just a bit embarrassing, and it's a bit funny almost sometimes as well. Sometimes, but sometimes there are perhaps potentially more serious situations, where there are safety concerns, where it calls for us to be a bit more attentive and a bit more considerate about other people's welfare as well as our own. Sometimes those etiquette rules are for good reason as well. But there's also another one that's come to mind where you sort of like, especially today, this changed a lot more. Like with shop assistants, when someone's serving me behind the till and I give them money, normally I will place the money into their hand because I think, and normally they'll give it back to me in my hand. That's normally how it works, I find. Very occasionally, some people don't like to do that. You put it down on the till and you slide it over to them. Or you just leave it on the till and then, in the middle. And that seems to be more and more the etiquette now, except some assistants are wearing gloves and then it's okay to put it in their hand, I guess. But other people, I'm sometimes not sure, give it to them or put it down. You have to sort of interpret it according to the person and what they're comfortable with, I suppose. So, I suppose it's just trying to interpret what the individual signals are giving to you. But the problem is there that sometimes some of us aren't as good at reading these signals as other people are. So, like somebody will be giving that eye contact and gesture and looking at you in a pub environment. Somebody might read that as an invitation. I want to talk to you. I'm interested in you. Or somebody else might just look at that and think, oh, what are you looking at? Or someone else just might think, I'm just looking at anyone. I'm just seeing who's about. Although we see the same signals and gestures, we don't always understand and read them the same, because sometimes we've got such different learnings and backgrounds, and we've had such different cultural and social influences in our lives. People have often lived and experienced very different cultures, and so sometimes if we've lived in a different culture, we may not understand what a signal or gesture means. For example, in some cultures, nodding your head actually doesn't mean yes, whereas to most of us, we would say that was taken for granted, it's obvious. But there are some cultures actually where I think, nodding your head like that doesn't mean yes, in actual fact. So you have to be very careful about reading what a signal actually means, and whether somebody understands actually what is meant at that point. I had a guy at work that used to do this sometimes when he waved, and sometimes it looked like he was doing a sort of Nazi salute, to be honest, but he wasn't. That was just his way of sort of waving. But he didn't wave his whole arm. It was more like he was sort of doing that, but with the arm sort of still. That was just his way of waving. He wasn't like a Nazi or anything like that at all. He was quite friendly, kind of it was quite a laugh. He was just quite a good-natured. But when I first sort of met him and he was doing that, I sort of wasn't sure what he was about, or if that was part of some secret sort of gesture, or until I got to know him more, what his character's about, and I could understand. He's not like that at all. He's very liberal and laid back, and that's just a thing he does. So I had to sort of be cautionary that not to sort of judge someone too soon because they do a gesture that you might misinterpret. And in the same way, somebody might wear a symbol or do a hand gesture, and you're not always sure quite what they mean by that, unless you get to know the individual themselves and what's typical for them in their type of language that they would normally use. So it's taking the time to get to know the individual, what their individual grammar, what's normal type of repertoire for them, a normal type of language, that is.